The spotlight was blinding white, cutting through the darkness like a blade. I was perched 30 feet above the stage, adjusting the final beam when I heard it. Not the usual crowd noise, not the rhythmic chanting. This was different, raw, primal, the kind of sound that makes your blood freeze in your veins. I looked down through the metal scaffolding, past the tangle of cables and rigging, and saw him collapse. Not a stumble, not a dramatic pause, a complete, devastating fall. The crowd thought it was part of the show. They were still cheering when I started climbing down, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the ladder. That was the moment everything changed. The moment the lights went out on more than just the stage. But before I tell you what happened in those final minutes, before I take you into that suffocating darkness where hope died and silence became deafening, I need you to understand something. Stories like this, they live in the shadows. They whisper in empty auditoriums and echo in the minds of those who witnessed them. They demand to be remembered, not because they're comfortable, but because they're true. If you've stumbled upon this channel, if you're listening to these forgotten tales, then you know that some memories are too important to let fade into nothing. Subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the belief that every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who understands that the past isn't just history. It's a living thing that shapes who we become. Because tonight, I'm trusting you with something I've never told anyone. Not my wife, not my therapist, not even the investigators who asked their questions with clipboards and tired eyes. This is for you, whoever you are, listening in the dark. Help me keep this memory alive. My name is Marcus Chen. I've been working in live event production for 12 years. But that night, October 15th, 2023, in Portland, Oregon was different from anything I'd experienced before. I'm a lighting technician, which means I spend most of my time invisible, moving through the skeleton of stages while crowds gather below. I work with shadows and illumination, creating atmosphere, building moments that speakers and performers inhabit. I'm the guy who makes sure the spotlight finds its target, who ensures that when someone steps up to deliver their message, they're bathed in exactly the right amount of light. The venue was the Memorial Coliseum, a concrete and steel monument that had hosted everything from basketball games to rock concerts to political rallies. On that particular evening, it was packed beyond capacity. Fire marshals would later estimate nearly 15,000 people crammed into a space designed for 12. The air conditioning had been struggling all day, and by evening, the atmosphere was thick and electric with anticipation. I'd been working events like this for years. Political rallies, corporate conferences, religious gatherings. They all follow a similar pattern: setup, sound check, crowd control, showtime, breakdown. But this one felt different from the moment I arrived that morning. The energy was more intense, more volatile. Security was tighter than usual. More cameras, more tension in the voices of the organizers. The setup had taken 14 hours. My team and I had arrived before dawn, when the Coliseum was still empty and echoing. We'd rigged lights across a complex framework of scaffolding, installed backup systems, tested every circuit 3 times. The main spotlighter, massive LED capable of cutting through fog and smoke with surgical precision, was my responsibility. It weighed nearly 200 pounds and required constant adjustment throughout the event to track movement across the stage. By afternoon, the first crowds were gathering outside. I could hear them through the concrete walls as I made final adjustments to the lighting grid. Their voices carried a fervor that seemed to penetrate the building itself. Chants, songs, the rhythmic stomping of feet that made the entire structure vibrate like a drum. The production team was nervous. I could see it in the way they checked and rechecked their equipment, in the sharp edge to their conversations. The venue coordinator, a woman named Sarah, who'd been working events for 20 years, kept glancing at the growing crowd outside with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, anticipation, something in between. When the doors opened at 6 p.m., the crowd poured in like water through a burst dam. They filled every seat, every aisle, every available inch of standing room. The noise level was overwhelming, even for someone accustomed to loud venues. It wasn't just volume, it was intensity, pure, concentrated emotion, given voice. From my position in the lighting booth, 30 feet above the main floor, I had a perfect view of everything. The stage stretched out below me, a raised platform about 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Behind it, an enormous LED screen displayed rotating graphics and video feeds. In front of it, an ocean of faces, all turned upward with expectant eyes. The opening act was scheduled for 7 p.m. Local politicians, warm-up speakers, the usual routine designed to build energy for the main event. But even during these preliminary speeches, the crowd was more engaged than I'd ever seen. They responded to every word, every pause, every gesture, as if they were personally connected to what was happening on stage. I spent the first hour making minute adjustments to the lighting design. Each speaker required different illumination, warmer tones for the elderly congressman, cooler blues for the young activist, harsh whites for the military veteran who spoke about border security. It's an art form that most people never notice, but lighting can make or break a performance. Too bright, and the speaker looks washed out, artificial. Too dim, and they disappear into the background. The goal is to make them appear larger than life, while still feeling human. By 8:30, the main event was approaching. Security had cleared the stage area, and final sound checks were being conducted. I was running through my lighting cues one last time when I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the Coliseum, near one of the emergency exits, a group of people were having what appeared to be an intense conversation. Their body language was agitated, urgent. One of them kept pointing toward the stage. I made a mental note, but didn't think much of it at the time. Every large event has its share of drama, its small crises, and last-minute complications. Protesters who somehow got tickets, technical difficulties, medical emergencies in the crowd. It's all part of the territory. At 9 p.m. sharp, the house lights dimmed, and my world transformed into something primal and electric. The crowd's roar became a physical force that seemed to push against the building's walls. My spotlight came alive, cutting through the darkness like a sword of pure white light, tracking across the stage to illuminate the podium. The speaker emerged from stage left, walking with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Wave of sound that made the entire steel structure of the Coliseum vibrate. Signs waved like flags in a hurricane. People were on their feet, pushing forward, straining against the barriers that separated them from the stage. I followed him with the spotlight as he moved to the podium, adjusting the beam to keep him perfectly illuminated. He looked comfortable up there, natural. He raised his hand, and the crowd gradually quieted to a level that allowed him to speak without shouting. His voice carried easily through the sound system, clear and commanding. For the first 10 minutes, everything proceeded normally. He spoke about familiar themes, the future of the country, the importance of standing up for beliefs, the power of unity in the face of adversity. The crowd responded predictably, cheering at the appropriate moments, laughing at his jokes, falling silent during his more serious passages. But as the speech continued, I began to notice subtle changes. His movements became more animated, more aggressive. His gestures grew larger, more emphatic. The crowd's responses became more intense, more personal. What had started as a political rally was transforming into something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. From my elevated position, I could see things that weren't visible to the audience on the main floor. Security guards positioning themselves differently. Paramedics moving closer to the stage area. Camera operators adjusting their equipment to capture different angles. It was like watching a machine reconfigure itself in real time, preparing for something that nobody wanted to acknowledge might happen. At 9:47 p.m., he paused mid-sentence. It wasn't a dramatic pause, for Effet I'd seen him do those before. This was different. He gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles white under the spotlight's glare, and for just a moment, his face showed something I'd never seen there before. Confusion, fear. The crowd hadn't noticed yet. They were still cheering from his previous statement, still riding the wave of energy he'd been building for nearly an hour. But I saw it. The moment when his eyes lost focus, the subtle sway in his posture, the way his left hand moved to his chest, almost reflexively. I leaned forward in the lighting booth, my hand instinctively moving to the spotlight controls. Something was wrong. Every instinct I'd developed in 12 years of live event production was screaming at me that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He tried to continue speaking, but the words came out slurred, uncertain. The microphone caught every syllable and amplified it across the Coliseum. The crowd's energy shifted, confusion rippling through the packed venue like a stone dropped into still water. That's when it happened. He didn't stumble. He didn't stagger. He simply collapsed, his body folding in on itself like a marionette whose strings had been cut. One moment he was standing at the podium, commanding the attention of 15,000 people, and the next he was on the floor, motionless, under the harsh white glare of my spotlight. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I've ever experienced. 15,000 people, all holding their breath at the same moment, creating a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the life out of the air itself. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds stretched into eternity. Then chaos erupted. The crowd's initial reaction wasn't panic, was denial. They thought it was part of the show, some kind of dramatic staging. A few people actually clapped. Others laughed nervously. But as the seconds ticked by and he remained motionless on the stage floor, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to horror. I was already moving, abandoning my post in the lighting booth and racing toward the emergency ladder that would take me down to stage level. My spotlight, now unattended, continued to shine down on the scene below, creating a perfectly illuminated circle of catastrophe that would be burned into my memory forever. Security reached him first. I watched from the ladder, about 20 feet above the stage, as they surrounded his body. One of them, a large man in a black suit, immediately began CPR. Another was speaking rapidly into a radio, calling for medical assistance. A third was trying to clear the stage area, waving people back with urgent gestures. The crowd's mood was shifting by the second. Initial confusion was giving way to panic. People in the front rows were pressing against the barriers, trying to see what was happening. Others were pushing toward the exits, sensing that something was seriously wrong. The orderly energy of the rally was dissolving into something chaotic and dangerous. By the time I reached stage level, paramedics were streaming in from multiple entrances. Their equipment looked alien and urgent under the stage light's defibrillators. Oxygen tanks, stretchers, boxes of medical supplies that I couldn't identify. They moved with the kind of professional efficiency that comes from dealing with life-and-death situations on a regular basis. I found myself standing about 10 feet from where he lay, close enough to see everything, but far enough back to stay out of the paramedics' way. The head of security, a woman I'd worked with on previous events, noticed me and nodded grimly. "You see what happened?" she asked. "He just collapsed," I said. One second he was talking, the next second he was down. She made a note on a small pad, then moved on to question other witnesses. I remained where I was, transfixed by the scene unfolding in front of me. The paramedics worked with desperate intensity, performing procedures that looked both violent and necessary. CPR, electric shocks from a defibrillator, injections of medications I couldn't identify. The crowd, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated. The house lights had been brought up to full brightness, destroying the intimate atmosphere I'd spent hours creating and replacing it with harsh clinical illumination that made everything look stark and unforgiving. Security personnel were trying to manage 15,000 panicked people with limited success. I heard fragments of conversations around me, medical terms I didn't understand, radio chatter about ambulance routes and hospital preparations, urgent discussions about crowd control and potential evacuation procedures. The organized machinery of emergency response was clicking into gear, but it felt inadequate against the magnitude of what was happening. At 10:13 p.m., I remember checking my watch. The paramedics stopped working. The sudden stillness was more definitive than any announcement. They didn't say anything, didn't make any grand pronouncements. They simply stepped back from the body, their equipment falling silent. The head paramedic, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and tired eyes, looked at the security supervisor and shook her head. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, but it communicated everything that needed to be said. He was gone. The next hour passed in a blur of controlled chaos. The crowd was evacuated in sections, with security personnel guiding people toward different exits to prevent stampedes. The stage area was cordoned off with yellow tape, transforming it from a place of performance into a crime scene. Police officers arrived and began taking statements from anyone who had been close to the stage. I was interviewed 3 times by 3 different people. A uniformed police officer who asked basic questions about what I'd seen. A detective who wanted more detailed information about the moments leading up to the collapse. A federal agent who seemed particularly interested in my observations about the crowd's behavior and any unusual activity. I might have noticed each time I told the same story. He'd been speaking normally, moving normally, appearing completely healthy, until the moment he simply fell. There had been no warning signs visible from my position, no indication that anything was wrong until it was too late to prevent. But even as I answered their questions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Some detail that my conscious mind had observed but hadn't processed. Something that might explain why a healthy 49-year-old man had simply collapsed and died in front of 15,000 people. The Colosseum didn't empty completely until nearly 2 a.m. By then, most of the crowd was gone, but the stage area remained active with investigators, medical personnel, and venue staff working to document and clean up. I was officially released from questioning around midnight, but I stayed to help with the technical breakdown. Dismantling a lighting system after something like this feels profoundly wrong. All that equipment, all those careful preparations, designed to create moments of inspiration and connection, reduced to cables and fixtures that need to be packed away and stored until the next event. It's like dismantling a cathedral after the last service has been held. I kept thinking about that spotlight, how it had continued to shine down on him even after he fell, creating that perfect circle of white light around his motionless body. The metaphor felt too obvious, too heavy-handed for reality, but there it was. The last thing he saw was probably that blinding white glare, and the last thing the crowd saw was his body illuminated, like something on an altar. The drive home took forever. Portland's streets were unusually quiet for a Saturday night, as if the entire city was holding its breath. I kept the radio off, unable to bear the thought of hearing news reports about what had happened. I needed time to process it myself before I could handle anyone else's interpretation of events. My apartment felt alien when I finally walked through the door. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning, but nothing felt familiar. The normalcy of my coffee cup in the sink, my books on the shelf, my cat sleeping on the couch, it all seemed to belong to someone else's life. Someone who hadn't watched a man die under a spotlight in front of 15,000 people. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him falling. Not the dramatic collapse itself, but the moment just before, when his face showed that flash of confusion and fear. The moment when he realized something was wrong, but before he understood how wrong it was going to get. The official cause of death was announced 3 days later. Massive cardiac arrest, probably triggered by an undiagnosed heart condition, exacerbated by stress and physical exertion. A tragic but not uncommon occurrence for someone his age, engaged in high-pressure public activities. The memorial service was held the following week at a different venue, a traditional church that felt more appropriate for mourning than celebration. I attended, though I'm not sure why. I sat in the back, surrounded by hundreds of people who had known him far better than I ever did. But I felt connected to what had happened in a way that most of them couldn't understand. I was the one who had lit his final performance. I was the one whose spotlight had followed him from entrance to collapse, creating the visual framework for his last moments of life. I was the one who had watched from above as his voice carried across 15,000 people for the final time. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to normal work. There were other events, other venues, other speakers who needed lighting. But something had changed in me that night at the Memorial Coliseum. I couldn't look at a spotlight the same way. I couldn't stand at a lighting console without thinking about the power and responsibility that came with controlling what people saw and how they saw it. Every performer who stepped onto a stage I was lighting became fragile in my eyes. Not just physically, but I was hyper-aware of how easily everything could change, how quickly a moment of triumph could become a moment of tragedy. My job, which had always felt technical and removed from the emotional content of events, suddenly felt intensely personal. The nightmares started about a month later. Not dramatic, cinematic nightmares, but quiet, persistent dreams where I was always too far away to help. Always watching from some elevated position while terrible things happened below. In the dreams, my spotlight would malfunction, leaving people in darkness when they needed illumination most. Or it would become too bright, blinding them when they needed to see clearly. I started seeing a therapist, a woman who specialized in trauma and workplace stress. She helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just the death of a public figure, but a fundamental challenge to my sense of control and purpose. I'd built my career around the belief that I could make things better, that my work contributed to positive experiences for both performers and audiences. That night had shown me how quickly and completely those assumptions could be shattered. The investigation continued for months. There were conspiracy theories, of course, wild speculation about everything from assassination plots to supernatural interventions. People who had been in the crowd that night started sharing their own stories, their own interpretations of what they'd seen and felt. Social media was flooded with amateur videos taken from dozens of different angles, each showing the same tragic sequence from a slightly different perspective. But none of them showed what I had seen from the lighting booth. The elevated view that captured not just the moment of collapse, but the broader context of 15,000 people responding to something they didn't understand. The way panic rippled through a crowd like a wave, starting from the front rows and spreading backward until the entire venue was consumed by uncertainty and fear. I was interviewed for a documentary about the event, filmed 6 months later. The filmmaker was interested in the technical aspects of what had happened, the behind-the-scenes perspective that most people never consider. I spent 2 hours talking about lighting design, crowd psychology, and the logistics of managing large-scale events. But when she asked me about the emotional impact, I found myself unable to articulate what I'd really experienced that night. How do you explain the weight of being responsible for someone's final spotlight? How do you describe the feeling of knowing that your last professional interaction with another human being was creating the visual environment for their death? These aren't questions that have comfortable answers, or any answers at all. The Memorial Coliseum reopened for events 3 months later. I was offered the lighting position for the first show back, a concert by a popular folk singer known for her thoughtful, introspective music. I declined. I wasn't ready to return to that space, to work in the same booth where I'd watched everything unfold. Instead, I took a job with a smaller production company that specialized in corporate events and private parties. Smaller venues, lower stakes, audiences that numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands. It felt like a retreat, but it was a retreat I needed to make in order to continue working at all. But even in these smaller settings, I couldn't escape the memory of that night. Every time I powered up a spotlight, every time I tracked a speaker across a stage, I was reminded of how quickly everything had changed in Portland, how a routine evening had become a defining moment that would shadow everything I did for the rest of my career. The first anniversary of his death was marked by memorial services across the country. I didn't attend any of them, but I watched the news coverage from my apartment, seeing familiar faces from that night, speaking about loss and legacy. They talked about his contributions to public discourse, his impact on political movements, his role as a voice for a particular segment of American society. All of that was true, and all of that was important. But for me, he would always be the man who fell under my spotlight, whose final performance I had lit without knowing it was final. He would always be connected to the moment when I learned that my work, my supposedly neutral technical work, was inextricably linked to the most profound human experiences. I kept working in live events for another year after that, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The joy I'd once found in creating perfect lighting moments had been replaced by an anxiety that never fully disappeared. I was always waiting for something to go wrong, always hyper-aware of how quickly celebration could turn to catastrophe. Eventually, I transitioned into film work, where the stakes felt lower and the environment more controlled. Movie sets have their own pressures and challenges, but they don't have the unpredictable energy of live audiences. If something goes wrong during filming, you can stop and start over. There's no do-or-die immediacy. No moment when 15,000 people are depending on everything working perfectly the first time. But I still think about that night. Not every day, but often enough that it feels like a permanent part of who I am. I think about the weight of witnessing, the responsibility that comes with being present for someone else's most important moments. I think about the thousands of people who were in that Coliseum, all of whom went home with their own memories and interpretations of what they'd experienced. Most of all, I think about the nature of performance itself, how it requires a kind of vulnerability that most people don't fully understand. Every speaker who steps onto a stage, every performer who stands under the lights, is placing their trust in dozens of people they'll never know. Sound engineers who make sure their voice carries clearly, security personnel who keep them safe, lighting technicians like me who make sure they're seen the way they want to be seen. That trust is sacred, and it's fragile. I learned that lesson in the most dramatic way possible, but it's a lesson that applies to every event, every performance, every moment when someone stands in front of others and tries to communicate something important. The man who died that night trusted me to light his final speech properly. He trusted me to make sure that his words reached the people who had come to hear them. He trusted me to be professional, reliable, invisible in the way that good technicians are supposed to be. I fulfilled that trust right up until the moment when trust became irrelevant and tragedy took over. But fulfilling it didn't make me feel successful or proud. It made me feel responsible in ways I'm still learning to understand. Some memories are too important to fade. Some stories demand to be told, not because they're comfortable or inspiring, but because they're true, because they capture something essential about what it means to be human, to be vulnerable, to place our faith in others and hope that they'll be worthy of it. Tonight, I've shared with you the story I've never told before, the story of a spotlight that became a memorial, of a performance that became a farewell, of a routine evening that became a defining moment in my life and the lives of everyone who witnessed it. This isn't just my story, it's the story of everyone who was there that night, everyone who saw what happened, everyone who felt the weight of witnessing, everyone who went home changed by what they'd experienced. It's a story that belongs to all of us, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered. Some memories fade into the comfortable distance of time. Others burn themselves into our souls and refuse to let go. This is one of those memories. This is a story that must never be forgotten. Subscribe to this channel if you believe, as I do, that every voice matters and every story deserves to be heard. Share this video with someone who understands that the past isn't just history, it's the foundation of who we become. Leave a comment if you've ever witnessed something that changed you forever, something that made you see the world differently than you did before, because ultimately, that's what stories like this are about. They're about the moments when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. When routine becomes tragedy, when the mundane world reveals its capacity for profound transformation. Keep this memory alive. Keep all our memories alive. In a world that moves too fast and forgets to isolate, we need people who are willing to remember. We need people who understand that some stories are too important to let slip into silence. This was my story. Now it's yours too. Don't let it fade into nothing.